You're listening to episode 88 of Pasta Chipotle. I'm your host, Rocio Carvajal, food anthropologist, Mexican culture and gastronomy educator. And through this podcast, I explore the gastronomic traditions and cultural history of Mexico. You can find more information about my podcasts, lectures, food tours, and publications in the description of the show. I know this has been a slow year for the podcast, but as you know, this is a handmade project, and although I wish I have had more time, duties and academic life tends to get in the way of things. But here we are, and that's what's important. This episode you're about to listen features an enriching and engaging conversation with Professor Iván Escamilla González, also known on Instagram as El Cronista Novohispano, the Novo-Hispanic chronicler. And together we turn our attention towards a historical take on food, exploring a range of contrasting aspects that go from upper-class feasting to famine and the making of new food systems in the Spanish viceroyalty in Mexico. We really had a lot of ground to cover. So let me tell you more about my guest. Iván Escamilla is a tenured researcher at the Institute of Historical Research at the National University of Mexico. His undergraduate studies, master's, and PhD degrees are all in history. His research covers several aspects of the Spanish viceroyalty in Mexico, including economic and political history, culture, and the Enlightenment in the early modern period. Iván is a terrifyingly prolific academic writer, and apparently his days have more hours than mine because he has published, coordinated 4 academic books and authored 2 on his own about ecclesiastical law and economic history in New Spain, and has published many articles in specialized journals. He has also participated in many public talks and conferences. Recently, Dr. Escamilla has been carving time to produce content in the form of short videos and posts on Instagram on different aspects of everyday life, politics, art, and religion in the Mexican viceroyalty. And I'm sure you can tell already that this will be a very enlightening conversation. It certainly was for me. So the first section of this episode offers a big overview about New Spain, its geographical, political, and social landscape, which prepares the basis to talk about the introduction of the Spanish food system. Then we discuss political feasting in colonial Mexico, and we contrast that to the history of hunger, famines, and riots. The fourth section explores aspects about the Trans-Pacific trade, and we end up with a discussion about the challenges of researching and socializing history in the age of social media. And, well, I think that covers it all for now. So without any further delay, let's get on with the show. I hope you enjoy this episode. Iván, it's so wonderful to finally have you on the show after all the months we spent preparing for this episode.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Well, I think we need to start by laying out some key aspects of the historical period we will talk about today, which covers 300 years of history, which is a long, long time. That goes from 1521 to 1821. So I would like you to set first the geographical context. So how did our country look like then? Which were the territories' geopolitical boundaries, and why did they change so much throughout the Spanish rule?
Of course. Well, let's start by thinking that New Spain, as this was called back in those centuries, did not exactly correspond with present Mexico's territory, right? It extended farther away from the present boundaries of Mexico, including the southwest of the United States, including Texas, New Mexico, California, but also in political terms, the authority of the viceroys of New Spain also extended, at least formally, to Central America up to the limits of Panama. So it was in political terms, let's say that New Spain was a much larger territorial political unit than present Mexico is, including many of today's Latin America's, specifically Central America, also the Caribbean countries, and as I said before, part of the United States. In fact, once the Spaniards started also to colonize the Philippine Islands, the Viceroy of New Spain also had some authority on the Philippine Islands. That means even in Asia, in the other side of the Pacific Ocean. So let's say that New Spain is a changing concept because it also changed according to the advance of the Spanish colonists over for instance, the northern territories of what presently is northern Mexico and also the southern United States. So more or less, that's the idea that we should have in mind when we are considering New Spain as a sort of political unit, as a larger unit, part also of an even larger unit, which is the Spanish Empire, which was spread throughout the world, in Europe, of course, but also in some parts of Africa, in the Americas, of course, and as I said before, part of Asia.
I mean, that first and foremost just expands our horizon. This will give you a much better understanding further as we talk about the relationships we had with all of these different parts of the world. And I think there is also conceptually a persistent controversy about the terminology we should use to describe this period. Some people refer to it as colonial, while others use viceroyal or noble Hispanic. And we will make references throughout the conversation of these three different concepts. So I think we might find some clues about that debate if we understand which type of government was installed at the beginning of the Spanish colonial regime and who were the most important political actors in this viceregal structure.
There's currently a very, very harsh debate about the use of these terms. Some people say that it is not correct to call this a colonial period or to say that New Spain was a colony of Spain. They think it was more precise to talk about a kingdom that was part of the Spanish monarchy, and since it was ruled by a viceroy, so it should be called a viceroyalty, and so anything related to this should be called viceregal. So let's say that there are very extreme positions on the debate, but I think we should try to stand more or less in the middle. What am I trying to say? In political terms, of course, when Hernán Cortés defeated the Mexica in 1521, he called this he established a new kingdom for the crown of Castile in Spain. So this was called the Kingdom of New Spain. No? Why was it called a kingdom? Because that was the classical political unit in those days. No? Europe was divided in kingdoms, right? So if this territory was added to the crown of Spain, it was logical that it should be called a kingdom. But that is a political term, right? It is not referred to anything but the political and legal relationship that this territory established with its metropolis, which was the crown of Castile, as the center of the monarchy of Spain. So even in the peninsula, there is this distinction between Castile and the other kingdoms that made part of the monarchy. So New Spain was, in political and legal terms, this kingdom, right? And since the king of Spain was never able to visit his subjects in this kingdom of New Spain, he had to send in his representation a viceroy, this person that was endowed with the authority to represent the monarch and rule over this territory. So this is the reason why we talk about the viceroyalty, since this territory is ruled by a viceroy. Well, but we should say that in those centuries, the word viceroyalty was not used. This is a term that historians have applied in the 19th and 20th centuries when they refer to this territory. What you see in documents, in chronicles from that period, is they talk about the kingdom. All of the time they talk about the kingdom. So viceroyalty is a term coined by historians to refer to the figure that was the character, that was in charge of this political unit representing the King of Spain. Now, let me stress this. This is only in political and legal terms. In social and economical terms, that's a whole different story, right? Because there was, since the beginning, there was not an equality between, say, the crown of Castile, the kingdom of Castile, and the kingdom of New Spain. The kingdom of New Spain was subordinated. So even in political terms, there was no equality between those political entities, right? And also, the kingdom of New Spain was built upon a very sharp difference between the people that lived in there, that they were all subjects to the king of Spain, but there were two basic types of subjects. One type were the Spaniards that came with the conquest, and the other was the Indians, the indigenous peoples. They were subject in many ways to the crown and to the Spaniards. There was a subordinate position that was endowed to these peoples. They had to recognize they were vassals to the king of Spain, so they had to pay tribute every year to the king, to the royal treasury, but they were also subject in terms that if the crown ordered these Indian vassals to work for the Spaniards, to give their labor to the Spaniards, they could not refuse to do this. So there was this position of inequality between Spaniards and Indians, and a whole set of political, economical structures were designed to stress the situation, that the Indians were subordinated to the Spaniards. And although the King of Spain, throughout all this period, always said that the Indians were under the protection of the crown, the truth is that the Indians were in this sense, they were treated like minors, like children, in the sense that they could not take their own decisions unless the Spaniards, let's say, approved of them in terms of political reasons. For instance, the election of the authorities that rule over the Indian pueblos, towns throughout New Spain, needed to be authorized and approved by Spanish authority. And so on, in many different aspects of life, the Indians were treated like minors that were tutored. So there was this condescendence toward the Indians, that in case the Indians, let's say, if they behaved well, that is, they obeyed what way they were ordered to do, well, they would enjoy this protection. But if they resisted, well, they had to face the consequences of this. So in that sense, it is absolutely correct, completely correct to say that it was a colonial system, since the people, the originary people from these lands, was subject to this authority and were not able to establish their own destiny. They were subject, like children, to the authority and the so-called protection of the crown. So they were placed in a lower position in this economical and social system. So this is all taking us to say that we, in terms of political relationships between the Crown of Spain and New Spain, yes, we can talk about the Kingdom of New Spain, the Viceroyalty of New Spain, the viceregal institutions, right? But when we are talking about economy and society, there is no mistake. This was a colonial system that was designed to proportion the Spaniards the advantages of enjoying the labor from the Indians, and also to extract the resources of this territory with the help of Indian labor. So, in a very simplified way, we could say that this is what we're talking about when we're thinking about those 3 centuries in New Spain.
Just to recapitulate a bit, so it is absolutely correct to refer to both this period and this system as a kingdom that operated under a colonial regime that was subject to a viceregal law. And we can also use this term, talking about the viceregal period, more accurately when we are talking about the scholarship of this period. So that really, really helps clarify things because, like you said, sometimes these entrenched conceptual debates, instead of helping us understand, they just polarize opinions without really informing. And your explanation was absolutely on point. That's a great start, and that will help us understand how the population of these in this colonial context took shape. So one of the unforeseen consequences of the Spanish conquest of Mesoamerica, but not only Mesoamerica, was the introduction, of course, of diseases, which, it wasn't deliberate, at least not in our case, that once they turned into pandemics, they killed millions of indigenous people. And some estimates say that it exterminated about 80% of the native population. But again,
up to 90%, according to some historians, right?
Yeah, because the historical sources vary so much. Like some indicate that the deaths reach 5 million, and that seems very conservative because others suggest like there were around 15 million people that perished. So, take your pick. Well, you will help us take our pick. And despite this imprecision, we can agree that the decimation of the indigenous population was a fundamental factor that influenced the decision of Spain to join the slave trade, which I remind listeners that meant the forced introduction of numbers, right? Between 12 and 14 million people from different African regions into the Americas between 1521 and 1867. And these are official dates. We know, and numbers, we know that reality shows us that, outside of the books, as it were, there's a lot more information. But broadly, in this context, New Spain alone was the final destination, again, of around 450,000 women and children. Men, of course, this complicated the sociocultural landscape of the newly founded viceroyalty. So, in previous episodes, I have talked about castas, this system of social classification that was enforced in the viceroyalty. You just said a little bit about the relationships of subordination. But in this, probably a bit more ethnically diverse landscape, the system was based, really on the instrumental use of ideas of race, sex, and other ideas, of the domination that legitimized this exploitation of people, which in plain terms meant that the Spanish regime used these made-up concepts of race to create this narrative of a supposed superiority of white Europeans over people with other ethnicities, as well as justifying the dominance of men over women. So help me out here, Ivan. How did these ideas of classifications translate into the making, on an operational level, on the casta system and its broadly 18 different types of typification?
Of course. Well, it's good that you brought up the subject of slavery, right? Because that's true. Without slavery, the colonial system wouldn't have survived. Because this terrible toll of epidemics forced the colonies to bring forcibly millions of human beings to the Americas. And Spain, even though the Spaniards were not the traders themselves, in this case, they benefited from that trade, and so they traded with the Dutch, with the Portuguese, with the Genoese, with the English. So they could have this supply of labor force in the colonies, and in the process, as you just said, they completely changed the human landscape in New Spain, because in some regions, the slaves brought by this trade completely substituted the indigenous population that had disappeared because of the epidemics. And in many other cases, that's especially in the cities, they joined the urban population and made a very important part of it. And so they started mixing with the indigenous populations, but also with the Spaniards. This mix was not at all pacific or the result of love stories. No, we have to say that there was a lot of violence involved in this. No, we cannot close our eyes to the violence that many times was the characteristic of relationships between the white masters and their black slaves, either men, male or female slaves, right? We should think in terms of each Spanish home or productive unit as a large family where the Spanish proprietary was the head of the house, was the head of the family that included the servants and the slaves. And many times this hierarchy expressed itself in terms of sexual violence. So the result was a mix that was not at all considered by Spanish legislation. It was not, as you said, a foreseen result of this, that there was a lot of population that could not trace their origin to a legitimate marriage. There was a lot of illegitimate children born from the unions of Spaniards and indigenous women, or Spaniards and black women. And the Spaniards feared about their top position in this system, because in terms of numbers, they were clearly a minority before hundreds of thousands of African slaves, of indigenous persons, of the people that resulted from these mixes. So they were clearly in a very difficult position to maintain their place at the top of this hierarchy. So this called for the use of some categories that were invented first in Spain. Especially, we should go back a little to the 15th century, when in Spain, the Crown of Castile, by the marriage of Fernando and Isabella, they decided that all of their subjects had to be Christians. So Jews and Muslims had to face conversion or expulsion or other types of violence. So many Jews, for instance, baptized to escape persecution from the Inquisition. And even though they had baptized and became Christians, they were not regarded as equals by the other Christians. So there was this distinction between Cristianos Viejos, those Spaniards that had always been Christians, and Cristianos Nuevos, these people that had baptized to escape persecution. So there was mistrust from the old Christians to the new Christians, because they thought their conversion was not sincere, and that secretly they continued to worship according to the law of Moses, as they said. So there was this first distinction between Cristianos Viejos and Cristianos Nuevos that established a difference, and also called for a segregation. So to avoid contamination, no? The old Christians feared contamination from the blood of the new Christians. So let's say that this was the origin of this distinction that was later brought to the New World. And in the New World, this, of course, they also continued to fear the mixing with the blood of new Christians, but this applied also to African blood. It was said that in moral terms, any mixing with African blood resulted in a moral degradation. We should think of race in the Spanish colonial systems, not in the modern sense of racism, which is based mostly on physical traits, like those that the anthropologists of colonial European empires used in the 19th century to proclaim that white Europeans were superior to the peoples of the rest of the world. Let's say that it was conceived in moral terms, that people with African descent had a moral status lower than the white Spaniards, and that reflected in their behavior. They were dominated by lust, drunkenness, and other sins that reflected on their general conduct. So there was this fear of contamination, and upon this fear was that it was established a sort of hierarchy, which was called or is known even today as the casta system. And the casta system worked in many subtle ways because there was not a precise classification, because we see the famous casta paintings, those images that reflect the result of this mix. There are these strange names applied to the result of these unions, like from mestizo, mulato, coyote, lobo, chino, tente en el aire, salta para atrás, ahí te estás, cambujo. Those words were, of course, racial slurs. But there was not really a precise classification. It was more arbitrary. In the end, it all reflected this fear of contamination and this fear of the violence of people that was not happy with this lower status that was assigned to them because of their African descent. There was very different subtle forms to mark this hierarchy, like, for instance, to use rumor, to spread rumors about the descent of someone. Like, say, this person's grandmother was a slave, or they say that his grandfather was of dark skin. So it was enough to destroy someone's reputation and also to keep him, for instance, to graduate or to be admitted to the Royal University of Mexico. Someone that could not prove that he was 100% of a clean descent, Spaniard, Cristiano Viejo, all of that, could not be admitted, and of course could not aspire to have the degree. So like this, there were many other subtle forms to keep people that was considered stained with this mark of African descent from scaling the upper layers of the system. Of course, then there was also ways to cheat on this system. So people managed to hide their origins and sometimes even climb on the social ladder. But the fact is that the hierarchy existed, and that was part also of this is one of the reasons that we can call this a colonial system, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let me just underline a few things. So, to understand the origin of social classification in the colonial context in the Americas, we need first to understand the religious extremism that ensued with the so-called Reconquista of Spain, right? So these polarized completely the ideological landscape, tainted by this religious extremism on behalf of Catholics, obviously. And then how it translates into a broader racialized understanding of the otherness and how this otherness is classified, right? In order to subjugate it. You made a perfect important point that when you talk about the reason is the fear of this minority to lose power. So they're going to enforce everything they can to create mechanisms of control, but also to prevent people from acquiring an education, which that meant an entry point to gain social mobility on a sort of political sphere, but also in other everyday life terms, right? Sanctioned behaviors, how these different people were allowed or not allowed to interact. And to sort of navigate this political, racial, and religious conundrum, there is an important historical reference here that I would like to explore, which is the famous Valladolid debates. We need to take a closer look, into the ideas that shaped this caste system. So the Valladolid debates occurred between two key actors. So the bad colonialist is Ginés de Sepúlveda, and the good colonialist is San Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a clergyman. And these debates that these two people had, they happened in the city of Valladolid, Spain, 29 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan. So in 1550, when society gets more and more ethnically complicated, they decide we need to sort this out, and we need to have this debate to decide what we're going to do with these people, but we need to decide how we're going to categorize them. So can you tell us what are the main differences between the views of the good and the bad colonialists, Sepúlveda and de las Casas, and how these debates ended up shaping forever and ever almost for the duration of this period inter-ethnic relationships and the whole cultural landscape of the Novo Hispanic society?
Well, we should say that this debate of Valladolid was part of controversies that started the day Columbus returned from his first voyage to the Americas, right? From that moment, it was clear that the people that lived in the New World, in this continent, were completely different from Europeans. They were people that had never been heard of, that were not in the catalogs of nations that medieval Europeans liked so much to compile. So it was necessary to establish what sort of creatures they were. There were doubts even regarding their human status, but the church very soon stated that these were human beings. So that meant they had immortal souls that could be saved by conversion to Christianity, right? So that was, let's say, the first condition for these debates, that they were people that could be saved, their souls could be saved, and it was the responsibility of the kings of Castile to help these people know the Christian message and be saved. That was one point. But the other debate here was, should these people be allowed to freely accept the Christian message and to freely become, on their own will, subjects of the crown of Castile? But that was a great debate. Were these people really free to these two to accept these two conditions as Christians, as subjects of the crown? And very soon, this conflicted with another reality, and that reality was that the Spanish colonists that very soon started to emigrate to the New World needed labor force. So how can you force them to work and in the same time regard them as free subjects of the crown that also are Christians and should be treated and respected as free Christian subjects of the crown of Castile? So that was one of the main reasons why this debate started. And very soon there were these very polarized positions that you have called the bad colonists and the good colonists, right? The bad colonists said, well, these people go around naked, they don't speak our languages, they're pagans, and they are cannibals. So that clearly shows them as barbarians and savages. And the destiny of barbarians and savages, according to the political theory of Aristotle, was to become slaves of the civilized people, in which in this case were, of course, the Spaniards, right? Ginés de Sepúlveda was a very highly qualified, we could call Renaissance humanist. He had studied the philosophical writers of the classical antiquity, like Aristotle, and in that sense, he just was applying this classical and ancient theory of free men versus slaves, right? And that it was very part of a natural order that some people, those barbarians, should serve as slaves of the free civilized people. And that was the extreme position of Sepúlveda and other people like him, that it was on the benefit of the Indians that they should be enslaved to the Spaniards, so the Spaniards could benefit from their work, and also they could eventually help them become authentic human beings in the sense of becoming civilized Christian people, right? But in the other side, there was the other position from Las Casas. Las Casas believed that these people should be allowed to freely choose to become Christians, should be preach the Christian message so they could decide if they wanted to accept the new religion and convert. And they also should be allowed to freely become subjects of the Crown of Castile and thus be protected by the laws of Castile to be incorporated into the new political order. I have to say that Las Casas, that was, let's say, the middle position of Las Casas, but in his last years, the last years of his life, Las Casas became a sort of radical. I like to say that unless many people that in their older age become more and more conservative, Las Casas became more and more radical in his last years, and eventually he came to say that the worst thing that had arrived to the indigenous people of the New World was the arrival of the Spaniards, that they should never have arrived there because there was no easy way to solve this conflict between this idea of allowing them to choose freely of their new status and those that say that they should be enslaved straight away. So in the end, the Spanish crown heard many expositions of these doctrines. Like the Valladolid debates between Las Casas and Sepúlveda was one of many of those debates that had started from the return of Columbus, as I said before. Eventually, the crown established a sort of official doctrine that said that the Indians were free subjects, but they also need to be tutored, which allowed them to work for the Spaniards, their labor force to be used in economical enterprises by the colonists, in the same time to be respected. So that was, let's say, the origin of this situation that started there. And as you said before, this has had consequences even to the present, because even after the independence, the national states that emerged in Latin America in the 19th century, they continued this relationship of tutoring and condescendence towards indigenous people. That's happening even today. That's an unsolved problem in all Latin American societies to this day.
Thank you. Thank you for pulling it to the present, because yes, that's how we can explain 20th century policies of indigenismo and present day policies of neo indigenismo, which aim to assimilate them into quote unquote modernity. But just to sort of wrap up this first section, I think it is important to say that the fact that this project included or had in mind settler colonialism, this was not a territory just to be exploited, but people were expected to live here. So that meant that Spain actively promoted the emigration of Spaniards to settle in New Spain. Therefore, there were many efforts made in order to adapt or replicate as much as possible their whole way of life. And that, of course, included their food system. So we're going to start preparing the transition into food. So can you explain, which were the priorities regarding, agricultural policies, maybe, and their role in the Novo Hispanic economy?
Yes, of course. Well, the crown wanted Spaniards, like you said, to settle here. People tend to think of the Spanish rule only in terms of what happened during the conquest, in the very beginning of this process, and that happens all to us Mexicans all of the time. You don't think that there were 300 years after the conquest of Mesoamerica. What the crown wanted in the end was that people established on this land and became this was a Castilian term that was very important to define this condition. They did not use the word colonist or colono in Spanish. They used the word vecino. And to establish in some land, to build a house, to start plowing the earth, raising cattle, that was called avecindarse. Vecino could roughly be translated to neighbor, someone that becomes a neighbor in some place, in some town, in some city. In the end, what the crown wanted was to replicate, as you have very correctly said, a very important part of the Spanish heritage from the Roman times on, and that was the founding of cities, and the city as the center of culture, society, and civilization. Right? So the Spanish colonization was translated in the founding of many cities and towns throughout all the territory. And the Spaniards, the settlers, coming to live in these towns and cities and becoming vecinos. But then becoming a vecino also meant that you were entitled to be given land by the government of that town or city. So you could have a living. So that was the way that the Spanish rule over this territory could be firmly established, by allowing people to live here and to start taking benefits from the land. And that means sowing and producing all sorts of foods, no? And also raising all races of cattle. So it was a very important part of the colonial system, that it was taken to the New World. So at a very early date after the conquest, the Spaniards began bringing animal and vegetable species from Europe to the New World, and they said their adaptation to the Mesoamerican, in the case of New Spain, the Mesoamerican environmental conditions. So we have wheat, cattle like pigs, poultry, of course. This also was part of a Spanish effort to bring their lifestyle to the New World, because, of course, in the beginning they had to be fed with whatever was here: corn, beans, chile. So when the Spaniards began to benefit from Indian tribute, they had to eat those things. But very soon they also tried to import their lifestyle to the New World. And they were, in this sense, helped by the crown, that wanted these people to stop plundering and start to live like vecinos in the new towns and cities that were the key to a firm Spanish grip over this territory. So this, from the very beginning, helped to bring these new elements to this land, and also to introduce them in whatever people was eating from the very beginning of the establishing of the colonial system. So we could say that the strengthening of colonialism also meant the beginning of a new way of life that combined what was original from these lands with everything that was brought here from the old world, from Europe.
Absolutely. That is such a great way to reintegrate the role of food systems into the colonial history of our territories, because one of the challenges in food studies is to teach the rest of disciplines, how to reintegrate food as a key component to human life, and also as a key driver of imperial and colonial expansion that is not just a byproduct and just a culinary expression, but is something that is fundamental to the way in which land is going to be appropriated, in which land is going to be exploited, and in which relationships of work are going to be designed based on these imposed systems of production. And that takes us into the next section, beginning to talk about food. We're still going to talk about politics, but obviously now with a twist. One fascinating aspect about this period is, of course, feasting, banqueting, and eating together in New Spain, because at this time, those things had decisive political undertones, and undoubtedly the most important occasions were feasting, were the receptions that were organized for each incoming viceroy that was always appointed by the Spanish monarch in turn. And thanks to extensive finance government records kept by the viceregal regime, we have a very good idea about the expenses that went into the logistics of these events. And the historical sources include general information about the money that was spent on food, drinks, desserts, snacks, and also entertainment, which included dancing, musicians, and even comedians and bullfights. So these were not just a sit and drink event. These were like we say in Spanish, dinner, dancing, and show, like cena, baile, show. That included everything. So according to historian Matilde Soto, celebrations lasted an average of 3 days, when every new viceroy came in. And considering we had 61 of them, with, an average ruling period, this was very unstable, obviously. So between 3 and 4 years. Sometimes less, sometimes more. One might think planning for these events really never ended. I think we can talk about a new social actor that appears in this culinary landscape of New Spain, and that is the Spanish male cook. Why don't you tell us more about these people, how they become the central figure of upper class kitchens in these celebratory contexts?
Of course, well, we have to first understand a couple of things. One of them is that the viceroy, as the head of the political system, set the tone for colonial elites in many things. We're talking about the descendants of the Spaniards that established here and became the colonial elites. And in many ways, they tried to imitate whatever new fashions and practicings that came from Spain. And the coming of a new viceroy was a very good occasion to know what was trendy in Spain in terms of behavior, in good manners, fashion, and of course on whatever was being cooked on the royal kitchens in Madrid. The colonial elites always looked forward to the arrival of a new viceroy. Also in political terms, because the reception of a new viceroy was a good moment to present themselves, to offer their services to the viceroy, to strike deals that benefited in terms of privilege, their social and economical position. So that explains that colonial elites spent a lot of money receiving new viceroys, not only in Mexico City, but also in the towns and cities that the viceroy visited in his way from Veracruz, where he landed from the crossing of the Atlantic, and all the way from Veracruz up to Mexico City. That was the moment when everyone made their best to show their best faces to the viceroy, to give gifts, to show that they were good subjects of the Spanish crown and they were eager to serve his maximum representative in New Spain, that was the viceroy. So that set the celebratory tone of this moment, the arrival of the new viceroy. You can't have a good celebration without a feast. So they had to spend also a lot of money in offering great banquets. That's what historian Matilde Soto has researched about the late 18th century, the money that was spent to give these great banquets to the viceroys and all the guests that were brought from the colonial church and secular elites, right? But this was a tradition that started from the 16th century, from the very first appointment of a viceroy in New Spain in 1535. And that continued. So we can imagine the enormous responsibility that laid on the shoulders of cooks in this kind of situation, right? But the cook was not an isolated individual. Regularly, cooks were part of the larger establishment that served the elites, or in this case also the viceroys, right? They worked as part of this larger group of servants in any elite household. They were part of a hierarchical system that considered them as part of the criados, that's the Spanish word to refer the people that live under the protection of a master. The master sees that their servants are well treated, that if they serve faithfully and good to him, they will be rewarded. And so the cook in any elite household of the 16th to 18th century is part of this system. Right? So he has to fulfill a series of duties that, if they are well done, will receive a reward from the master. So they have to be very smart in using the money they are given to buy all the foods that are needed for a banquet. These are great celebrations with up to 50 people sitting at the table and being served up to 20 to 25 dishes during the course of these banquets, right? This is what the chronicler said, and that includes the first dishes, then salads, the red meats, fish, and then desserts. We have to think all the organization that was necessary to cater any of these great banquets by these cooks. The banquet was a very special occasion, but during the rest of the time, they also had to fulfill these same duties as part of this hierarchical system that exists inside an elite household. That applies not only to the cook, but also to the rest of the people that help in the kitchen. So we have to think of the cook as the head of a small house within the house that has even its own hierarchy that includes free and enslaved people working in the kitchen, applying their own knowledge about preparing food, the use of certain ingredients, about the flavors and tastes of things, and all working under the of the cook that will also instruct the footmen, the gentilhombres as they are called in Spanish, bring those dishes to be served. And also, if there's order in the kitchen, there's also a hierarchy in the table. And we have these references from a banquet given to the Archbishop of Mexico, which happened also to be the viceroy in that moment. When he receives his appointment as Archbishop of Mexico, he invites the elites to this great banquet. He sits in the middle of the table. On the left, he sits the next most important church authority, which was a canon of the cathedral of Mexico. And on the right, the next highest political authority, which was an oidor, that means a judge from the High Court of Mexico City. And so the rest of the guests are sitting according to this hierarchy. And then let's think of the gentilhombres entering this large hall and serving the dishes one after the other to these people according to this order that was established in the table itself. So it's all a great show if you think of it. More than just sitting to eat. It's about showing what's the social colonial order on the kitchen and then on the table, which is fascinating in my opinion.
It is, and I'm so glad you talked about this micro universe in the kitchen, because I always like to explain domestic colonial kitchens like a replica of the social relationships that occurred in society, outside of the domestic environment, but also as a kind of experimental, like a testing kitchen of sorts, right? Because that is the space in which voluntarily and involuntarily people had to share knowledge concerning the use of ingredients, cooking methods, but also communicating the symbolic political use of food. Because not only it was like a superimposition of Spanish hierarchies and categories and in the ways in which these relationships occurred, they were also constructing them actively, like you said, in the kitchen, but also at the table, because this was a landscape that didn't exist in Spain. These elites had to make up their own rules in order to manage their relationships. Also, like you said, like the head of this little kitchen army, sometimes led by men in these big occasions, but domestically, they would be led by women in affluent households. Like you said, no, there would have been Spanish women of different ethnic origins from Spain, and also indigenous women and enslaved women as well, not sharing all this knowledge. Also, you talked about this trajectory that some of the viceroys, those that came from Spain, had to do, once they crossed the Atlantic and had to land in Veracruz, and they had to travel around, give or take, 22 days from the port to the capital. It was a constant journey of celebrations and social occasions in which every political actor had to make the point to establish a good relationship with the incoming authority, right? So it was very important for everyone to set a good precedent. I think I can probably put together two questions that I want to know. In some of the documents, they refer to the guests as the people that will attend, people of quality or good quality. And that would include clergymen, like you say, members from the government, and probably economic elites as well. So what are the rest of the people of quality, and what are the who are the people of not quality? And second, you gave us this great image of how the structure will happen at the table. So not always order and hierarchies were sustained. And sometimes it didn't work at all. And chaos ensued in more than one occasion. And I know you have a fabulous example of a banquet that went very, very wrong in 1750. So I can't wait to know all about this. So on to you.
Well, when we talk about colonial elites, we are referred to people that claim their Spanish lineage, no, the criollos, as they were known here, which criollo means simply from the land, no, someone born from this land. It could be applied to anything, the adjective criollo. But in New Spain, it basically referred to these people of supposedly pure Spanish descent, right? Because when you start digging deeper on their genealogies, you start to discover very interesting things that they were not willing to show or to admit about their origins. You start to see that there's more than one people of mulatto descent. No, they were the sons of free mulatto or black women that were incorporated in the Spanish family. But let's say that in general terms, it was these people of Spanish descent, either Spanish immigrants, recent immigrants. We're talking about rich merchants that traded with Europe through the Atlantic, but also with the Philippines through the Pacific, that whenever they became rich with trade, they also started dealing with financing mining. So that also allowed them to tap, let's say, on the flow of silver that came from new Spanish mines to Mexico City to Europe. So they own a very important share. So that in time allowed them to marry into Creole families that claim their descent from the Spanish conquistadors from the 16th century. So let's say that this renewed these elites throughout the time and climbed on the social ladder, and they married into the much more traditional criollo families that existed here, that owned haciendas, that owned mines, large houses in the cities, that educated their sons to become lawyers, physicians, clergymen, no, and so continue renewing these colonial elites, the gente de calidad, or gente de razón, which was the other term that was very used by them to distinguish themselves from the Indians and the indigenous people, and also, of course, from the slaves or the descendants of slaves, right? And they are very proud people from pure bloodlines, that they are all Christians, that they are all knighted, that have been rewarded by the crown because of their faithful services to the king. So that made a lot of this portrait of themselves that these elites they are very proud to show, for instance, to the viceroys, right? They present themselves with these credentials to show that they are the rightful owners of this land, o como se decía, los señores de la tierra, the lords of the land, right? Either because of a right earned by the conquest itself, or in later times by enriching themselves and preserving these values associated with Spanish origin elites, right? So whenever the viceroy starts to do the everyday business of ruling this kingdom of New Spain, these elites will try to have a good relationship with them. Well, they also have houses in the country, in the outskirts of the city, like, for instance, Tacubaya and Coyoacan in Mexico City, that were towns that were also the preferred retirement places for these elites. Whenever they wanted to escape the noise and all the business in the city and have meetings and celebrations and feasts in those houses. And sometimes they would literally invest all they had to invite the viceroys and their wives to these houses to share a good time, a good meal, and also entertainment like dances, music, and some things that you have mentioned before, right? So there's this amazing story that was registered by a chronicler in the mid 18th century. There's this viceroy that had just arrived from Spain, the Conde de Revillagigedo, and after like 3 or 4 single viceroys, there's this first viceroy that comes finally with a wife. So everyone is inviting them to their country houses, and at some point they're invited to this large house in Tacubaya. There's this great banquet, but somehow there's no control on who's entering the house. Suddenly there's a lot of uninvited guests, ordinary folks that start entering the house and start serving food. And in the end, when finally they can expel everyone from the house, even the silver spoons and forks from the table have been lost, stolen by the ordinary people that has entered the banquet. So what this is telling us is that even though the colonial elites try to show themselves as the best preservers of this social order, there were many occasions when people were able to jump, let's say, over the fence and do their best to show the elites that they were, in the end, part of this society. They were part of this land, that this land was also theirs, not only the elites. And so I think the viceroys that helped them to understand what was the very colonial nature of this society, right? That it was a society that was very different from Spain, that probably would never have happened in Spain, right? Only in Mexico, like we say today, no? Solo en Mexico, no? This only happens here.
That is such a great passage to understand the tensions between these not very stable classifications within society that were always bleeding into each other, competing for space and contesting the legitimacy always, not of these elites. We're talking about eating together. There is one concept I really, really like in food studies, the idea of commensality. So what is commensality? I like to describe it in very simple terms. It refers to all the activities that occur around the act of eating together. And by studying everything that happens when we eat together, we can see how food facilitates socializing, but also how commensality punishes certain behaviors, helps also develop bonds of kinship. And also commensality forces to look into the cultural codes and behaviors that people use to signal their status, to signal their attitude, signal their identities, their allegiance, everything else that will help define social relationships. And part of it is entertainment. In this context, the height of the Baroque also in Spain, banqueting included many other things, right? There is the work of a historian, Miguel Ángel Vázquez Meléndez, about musical instruments that were present in these celebrations or occasions, including things that were provided for the people who attended these events. And these musical objects included whistles, trumpets, sometimes were sold, sometimes were given. They gave them refreshments like aguas frescas, sometimes food. But I have many questions about it because this is something we don't know much about, and particularly the use of music in these occasions. So, what kind of musicians would take part in these events? If there's music, was there also dancing? What kind of composers were the most famous? So, help us understand this other side of these events.
Well, it is clear that it was not conceived that you could give a great banquet without also offering people the chance to enjoy themselves in conversation with music and then, of course, dancing. There's even a Spanish word for this, sarao. Sarao is this sort of social gathering where you enjoy all those things. The food, that's the music, that's the dancing. This is a classical form of entertainment in the Spanish court, in the Royal Palace of Madrid, and in palaces of the aristocracy. The sarao was the classical form of gathering people to enjoy themselves and to show off the signs of their social status. So this was brought to New Spain from a very early time. So we have in the 17th century very clear signs that this culture of partying was very well established by mid 17th century New Spain. The works of most famous Mexican poet of the colonial period, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, we have many mentions to this sarao in the palaces of the elite. It's an admitted place for a conversation between men and women. There's great concern about illicit relationships outside the bonds of marriage. So the elites try to keep this all very calm, very respectful. So they give these saraos as a way to allow men and women to socialize together. This is a very good moment of also to negotiate certain relationships that could become later marriages between important families of the elite. It has an importance from that social point of view. So they would have the banquets, but then of course the music. Usually musicians were hired. They were not part of households regularly in New Spain. Even in the viceregal palace, there were not resident musicians. So you had to find them in the cities. For instance, the musicians that played for the religious services in the cathedral. Those were some of the best musicians available because the church invested a lot in having good music to give more dignity to religious ceremonies. So if you wanted good musicians, you went to the musical chapel of the cathedral to find them and to hire them and to ask them to play not religious music, right? But secular entertainment that included, of course, compositions that came from Spain, from Spanish court music, but also music that included influences from New Spain itself, influences of the indigenous peoples, and also, of course, very important, from the people of African descent. And it is commonly said that some of the musical forms that were very popular in Spain and New Spain in the 17th century, we're talking like dances like the sarabanda, which are commonly regarded as the result of this mixing of European and African influences that happen in this context of the sarao. When you hired musicians from the cathedral, there were Spanish, Creole, Indian musicians, but there were also African musicians. The cathedral had slaves only for the purpose of using them as musicians. They were bought by the cathedral to sing and to play music. So they were very talented musicians. So we can have this idea of this entertainment for the elites with the musicians playing for the dancers, and between them free but also enslaved people showing off their musical talents. This is a very interesting point of elite festivities. There, you could not have a good sarao if you didn't have also a theater representation, like a comedy, comedia, written by some famous poet from Spain, or many times in the 17th and 18th century, a local poet. Like it was the case of Sor Juana. Sor Juana wrote a lot of entremeses, theater pieces, for the representation in the saraos, either in the Palacio Virreinal, or the Viceroyal Palace, or in the houses of the elite. And so we have many examples of these theater pieces that were written for those occasions. Even the clergy attended this kind of festivities. It's very interesting when we put together all of these elements. We can understand the importance this had to make this sort of cocktail of cultural influences that are better shared when you are feeling fine, when you have 2 or 3 glasses of wine or 2 or 3 jicaras of pulque. We know that this was very important for many of things that even to this day are part of our culture of festivity in Mexico.
That is so wonderful. Of course, people can't see, but I was jumping with excitement because I had no idea that the Metropolitan Cathedral in Ciudad de Mexico had enslaved African people that were professional musicians. That completely blows my mind. And of course, leisure in the colonial context is such an understudied aspect. Pastimes, entertainment. We are so used to study what is quote unquote elevated or more serious aspects, religion, politics, social relationships, economics, whatever. But there's so much we can explore and help us understand better society, how these spaces were spaces also of transgression, of behavior, even between the elite. They allow themselves to transgress things that probably they wouldn't occur in the same way in Spain, but they did happen here. In this context of having these characters like playwriters, musicians, that allow the participation of actors that otherwise would not have had the chance to be in the same space as these elites, like having a woman and a religious woman writing plays for the entertainment of people, and also having enslaved people enriching music and providing this amazing new creative landscape for the entertainment of ultimately also everyone, right? It's a real shame that here in Mexico we don't have a similar document like the Códice Trujillo from Peru, which is a wonderful text. It is one of its kind that includes music sheets, but also descriptions of the steps, even the costumes, and that is such a wonderful window, right, into this world of leisure and entertainment that is just so alien to most of us who think of this period as dry and stiff. It was also a hugely creative moment in our history. And you talked about something that facilitates entertainment and good times, and that is, of course, alcohol. Yay! So, in previous episodes, I have extensively talked about pulque, the social and ceremonial role in pre Columbian Mexico, and a bit of its struggles and survival in the colonial and post colonial context, the tribulations and challenges it has faced. But I confess that I have really not talked about, or nothing really, about wine, spirits, and other alcoholic drinks that were consumed. Because of all the sources that you've mentioned, we know that within the budgets for official banquets, we know that wines and spirits and all of these feature prominently into the things that consume most of the budget, right? Because they were expensive. So there are mentions of wines of different qualities, including like sherry, Bordeaux, Moscatel. So it's like, wow, like we're talking about a real diversity here. And I found this in preparation for this episode because I really didn't know much before. So I confess I know very little also about the production of wine in New Spain. I am aware, however, that the production of wine was highly discouraged and at times even forbidden, mainly because there were economic benefits hugely important for the government. The very, very hefty taxations that were imposed meant an important source of income. So, on the other hand, we definitely know that male religious communities, namely Jesuits, but not only, had a key role at introducing grapevines in different parts of Mexico and started a wine economy, but that was also sort of kept underground because of these regulations. So what can you tell us about maybe other types of imports of wine or about the landscape here?
Well, the question about the consumption of wine and the import of wine, that's a sign of that this is a colonial society, right? A colonial economy. Because the south of Spain was a great producers of wines and aguardientes or brandies. The Spanish crown from the very beginning was interested in protecting those producers from Andalusia in Spain. From the very beginning also, it mostly prohibited the production of wine in the American colonies. Legally, it was forbidden to introduce the grapevines and to produce wine, so all of the wines could be imported from Spain. Large barrels of wine were an important part of the imports that came to Veracruz every year in the merchant fleets or flotas that came every year from Sevilla or Cadiz in the 18th century. So it was all a matter of protecting the Andalusian producers. The colonial economy was in that sense subordinated to Spanish economy. So that's a classical colonial situation, right? In the other hand, it is true, as you have said, that some religious communities, and especially the Jesuits, in their missions most in the northern part of New Spain, attempted to produce some wine because it was necessary, obviously, part of Catholic liturgy, as the wine that is consecrated during the Mass. As a matter of fact, the King of Spain paid for all the wine that was used in consecration in the churches of all of its dominions in America. It was paid by the crown. So wine and oil. So there could always be wine for the consecration and oil for the lambs burning in front of the altars in all of the churches. This is even a symbol of the Spanish crown, right? As part of the colonial religious order in New Spain. So the Jesuits produced some wine in their missions in the north, in San Luis de la Paz, for instance, but it was very small amounts, mostly local consumption. In Peru, there was also some production of wine in Pisco, for instance, and from that came the creation of Pisco in Peru. But mostly it was all imported from Spain, wine or brandy. But then that did not stop colonial society from producing a very large variety of different beverages as a result of distillation processes. Some 25 or 30 different varieties of products of distillations with very strange names like Rosoli, Mistela, that they use fruits like oranges, different ingredients, because people needed something to drink. There was a great culture of drinking, and the brandies from Spain were not enough. For instance, in the mining towns like Zacatecas or Guanajuato or San Luis Potosí, there was large consumption of products of distillation, because whenever the mining workers had some money in their pockets, they went running for some drinks. Sometimes imported production was not enough, so they had to be locally produced and sometimes even invented by local producers. Money in the pockets of the mining worker meant they could buy clothing, they could have some fun, and they could also have some drinks. So there was this large market for distillation in New Spain, and the crown attempted to prohibit the production of these beverages, because in this sense they always tried to protect Spanish producers of brandy. And there was even a special court that was called the Juzgado de Bebidas Prohibidas, the court for the prosecution of forbidden beverages. There was this legal discourse that these beverages were harmful for health, so they had to be forbidden because they could kill the people that drank them. That it wasn't true, of course. They only were trying, I insist, to protect Spanish producers. Even though we didn't have a wine producing culture here, because it was all imported from Spain, and probably it was not very good wine from the transatlantic crossing, right? So it had to be mixed with all sorts of things. We managed to have our very own culture of distillation that also produced things in later parts of the colonial period, like tequila and mezcal. It was part of the same culture.
Whoa, that's amazing. Like, first, I didn't know about these special court, but this just helps us understand alcohol and regulations from, centuries before present day ideas. We don't think that it happened before, and it happened in different contexts. But if we talk about food, we need to talk about the other side, which is scarcity, right? Because food was not always abundant and was not always enjoyed by everyone. And I mention this because the absence of food is so important to study, and also to help us understand the proper landscape, because food crises occurred many times, but we need to understand why they happened and which were the effects on the population. Obviously, also, which were the strategies in place to overturn these moments of crisis. But I also have to say that famines were not an exclusive phenomena of the colonial period. And we also know that in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, there were many times of food crisis, right? Having said that, it is true that there were many other aspects that exacerbated and presented a vulnerable food landscape in the viceregal context that was marked by colonization, the disruption of pre-existing food systems, change of the use of land, and yes, also environmental factors like droughts, floodings, diseases that plagued the territory for a long, long time. You know a lot about the role of political authorities in the control of the production, supply, and distribution of food that was key to overturn these events or manage them. How about we start with that as a broad context?
As you just said, we're talking about here an agrarian society, and every human society from the beginning of agriculture to the 19th century. It was all a matter of having good weather, that there wasn't too much rain or there wasn't too much dryness, so the harvest wouldn't be lost. So there was this dependence that influenced heavily on society, right? Even on religion. There were patron saints to ask for rain or to ask for rains to stop so the harvest wouldn't be lost and there wouldn't be scarcity and then probably hunger. Hunger was always lurking behind these societies as a permanent threat because it got worse. Because if there was hunger, there would certainly come the epidemics that preyed upon people's weakened organisms by hunger, right? Because also the scarcity of food and hunger could mean a restless society that would be able to do anything to get food, and so a threat to social order and stability. So in those times, it was considered that one of the main responsibilities for any ruler was to keep people fed. It was part of political doctrine to avoid these consequences. So rulers and the cities had as one of their main responsibilities to keep warehouses that were stored with grain. The alóndigas, depositos, that's what they were called. The government of the cities would go to nearby zones and buy the harvest from producers of wheat and corn and keep them in those granaries to sell them to people to keep scarcity at bay. But sometimes when weather conditions cause the loss of harvests, owners of very large agrarian estates, the haciendas, would think in terms of their own benefit. They would hide the production from their haciendas, expecting that the prices would rise and they would get more benefit from that. Inevitably, that caused scarcity and unrest in the cities. You can see in the instructions that every viceroy left for his successor. In all of those documents, there's always one section that says you have to keep Mexico City well fed, and you have to avoid at all costs social unrest because of lack of food. So that gives you an idea of the importance, even political importance, that this had for controlling colonial society. But sometimes the weather conditions did not help, especially by the end of the 17th century. Weather historians have established first that the 17th century was in average colder than previous centuries. Specifically, the late 17th century was a very, very difficult moment for the northern hemisphere. So Mexico City suffered some of its worst moments of scarcity. Also, Puebla suffered from that. For instance, in 1692, the most famous riot in Mexico City history took place because there was a scarcity of food. And the result was that the Viceroyal Palace was destroyed by the crowd, and also the house of the city government. And there was also attempts of rioting in Puebla and Tlaxcala. So that was a very practical demonstration of the importance of avoiding scarcity and keeping these mechanisms of control working properly to feed people. We have terrible descriptions of what happened when hunger struck the colonial population. People fleeing towns into the cities, people dying in the roads, and the cities filled with people begging for some food because there was nothing to eat in the fields, because all of the corn, all of the wheat had been lost. And whenever that happened, usually their only resort was go to the church, because the church was paid every year a tenth of agriculture production, the tithe, as it was called, el diezmo. So the church tried to feed people with the grains that it kept in its granaries. It was a very difficult situation, and once again, it proved how unjust was the colonial system in the way that those owners of large extensions of land and of large stocks of grain could benefit from situations socially were so terrible for people, right?
Yeah, I had totally not considered, of course, the role of grain supplies owned by the church. And I am aware that the relationship between Puebla and Ciudad de Mexico in these moments of crisis was always very contingent, because in my region we were like the breadbasket, basically, of New Spain. But yes, Puebla had to save many times Ciudad de Mexico, but sometimes Puebla couldn't feed itself, like you very well said, no? And we also had a really jarring moment with scenes that are so alien to us. People dying of hunger in Mexico. Everything goes back to the injustices of the colonial system. But I also like that you put different scenarios on a national level, but also a local level in Ciudad de Mexico. And I think that those comparisons are very useful. And with that in mind, there is a very interesting case of a mini famine on board of a ship that was bringing the Marquis of Villena in 1639 that his crew experienced on the way to New Spain. And maybe we can link that to, do we have any knowledge about an estimate death toll of these crises?
Well, that's very difficult to know, right? Because the registers that the church kept of people that were buried, there is no separation between the victims of the epidemics and victims of starvation. Sometimes you have to assume that whenever there's a large epidemic in New Spain, there's a combination of the two factors. We can think of the late 1730s in New Spain, the crisis caused by the epidemic of Matlazáhuatl. The number of victims in Mexico City was calculated around 40,000 people, and more or less so in Puebla. In 1786, there was also a great crisis by scarcity of food, and we have reports of thousands of people dying from Valladolid de Michoacán to the surroundings of Mexico City. So it's not easy to know, but we can think in the order of the thousands of people when some of the larger crises hit the agricultural system of New Spain. Indirectly, we can know of the effect that this crisis had on small towns. There's a lot of documents from the Puebla and Tlaxcala region where the local Indian governments are asking the government in Mexico City to suspend the tribute for 2 years. And the Audiencia de Mexico, the High Court of Mexico, concedes this 2-year suspension of tributes so these people can get on their feet back again.
And what about these lovely lovely, I said. Funny.
Oh, yes, of course. Sorry, I was forgetting about that. Well, I think that's interesting because it says a lot about this thing I was saying at the beginning, and that it was the responsibility of the ruler to feed people, to have people free from hunger and disease. There's this story that takes place when the Viceroy the Marquess of Villena, comes from Spain to start his 4-year government in New Spain, and he goes on board a galleon that is part of the great commercial fleet that's sailing from Seville to Veracruz in 1639. And so in the middle of the sea, there's this, like you said, a mini crisis. People are dying by the numbers on board of the galleons, and they are suffering from hunger because in those days, traveling across the Atlantic was a very dangerous enterprise because a lot of people died, even wrote their testament before going up the ship in Seville in case that they could die either during the trip or landing in Veracruz and catching the yellow fever that was a very common cause of death for people that came from Spain in the galleons. They were so weakened by disease or hunger during the more or less 2-month travel from Spain. And when they landed, many people died in Veracruz or in the way from Veracruz to Puebla. There were even hospitals for the people to help them recover or to die a Christian death. And in this case, in 1639, there's this little epidemic and hunger crisis on board the ships of the fleet that's coming from Spain to Veracruz, and the Marquess of Villena has brought with him a lot of supplies, bread, curated meats to feed his family and his servants. He opens these supplies so people can feed themselves. he gives away medicines from his own stocks, and the wine, brandy, gives them away to all the ships in the fleet, and so he saves a few lives. Why? Because he feels it is his responsibility. He's the biggest authority as the newly appointed viceroy, as the representative of the monarch, and so this is what happens when a ruler tries to fulfill his duties in this sense.
And just a last thing to close this section, when you said, like, they try to avoid the worst case scenario, and the worst case scenario was a riot taking full force. So what kind of people participated in this riot? Like, did everyone participate? Like rich, poor, enslaved people? And how were these riots controlled? Like, because I imagine that when violence breaks in a colonial context, there would have been occasions that will turn into a catalyst for all the many social tensions and problems that were constantly brewing, and they just like use these moments also to channel that frustration, anger, etc. So how bad did these riots get?
In 1692, for instance, we know from the different documents we have that all sorts of people participated. The indigenous people from the Indian barrios or neighborhoods of Mexico City, also the mestizos, the mulattos, and as one chronicler said, even some poor Spaniards that forgot their duties to God and the king and participated with the rioting crowd in the destruction of the viceroyal palace. So it was a very general phenomenon that people from all origins participated in these riots. Of course, in that moment, the elites shut the doors of their houses and waited for everything to end. But sometimes they took the pacification in their own hands. And in 1692, for instance, we know that some of the richest merchants of Mexico City gave firearms to their servants and went to the streets and started firing on the rioters to end this commotion and the violence. So they used direct violence from the elites against the people. And why is that? Many of the listeners probably don't know it, but there was not a regular army in colonial Mexico. That was established only in the final years of the colonial era, in the late 18th century. But before that, there was not a permanent military force to enforce the rule of law. Usually when it was necessary to defend against pirate attacks against seaports as Veracruz or Campeche, people armed themselves and went to defend their own houses and properties. In this case, only after the elites put out the social unrest in the streets of Mexico City did the viceroy came out of his hiding in the convent of San Francisco, where he had been hiding all of the night from the 8th to the 9th of June of 1692, when this riot took place in the city. And only after that, he ordered this militia of servants from the rich merchants to patrol the streets of the city and to arrest the people suspected to have participated in the riot, and started judging and executing them in the Plaza Mayor or main square in Mexico City. It was a moment of a general social conflict that opposed the elites to the masses with practically no intervention from the state. That's the reason why they tried to avoid at all costs that this happened, because it was practically a social war in the moment the violence started.
Yeah, I was going to say that it pretty much turned again and again into a civil war, basically, right? So you established at the beginning the whole extension of the Spanish territories that were controlled during its colonial expansion, and also the extent of New Spain that not only encompassed part of the northern part of the American continent, also Central America, and the archipelago in the Philippines. So to bridge this with maritime trade, I have in a previous episode talked about the culinary sort of links between Africa, Spain, and the Americas. I contest the oversimplified view of the viceregal culinary and agricultural landscape of food just as a mere fusion of the Spanish and the indigenous ingredients, practices, foods. But with that big geographical and geopolitical context that you gave us, then we can unfold all of these possible sources of places from where foodstuffs were imported, but also where our own produce ended up being exported or extracted, right? So, we talk about the Spanish East Indies, the archipelago of the Philippines, part of Micronesia, and the trade that we had with India, China, Japan, different parts of Africa. Well, that gives us many entry points or points also of extraction of things that ended up in the pantries of the very, very wealthy houses in New Spain. All those ingredients, mainly spices, but not only, ended up obviously dotted around dozens of dishes that survive to this day. Well, I say dozens, probably hundreds, right? I know it's a very unfair question, these, but can you give us kind of like an overview of the trans-Pacific and intercolonial, and this is a very important concept, right? The intercolonial trade and the role of these wonderful fleets that were the several Manila galleons that operated between the port of Acapulco and several different ports in Asia, Africa, and Europe between the years of 1565 all the way to 1815.
It's a very interesting story, right? The bond between New Spain and Asia throughout basically all of the colonial period. It's very interesting because practically the next day after the fall of Tenochtitlan in the hands of the Spaniards, Hernán Cortés was already thinking how to establish a trade route between this territory that he had just conquered between central New Spain and the Islas de la Especiería, the Isles of the Spices, in the Asian part of the Pacific that were always wanted by the Europeans. They always wanted to participate in this trade. So the Spanish were trying to find a way to cross the Pacific into the East Asian trade. It was achieved in a very early date. As you have just said, in 1565, it was possible to establish a permanent sea trade route between New Spain and the East Asian coast. Only 6 years later, in 1571, the Spaniards established the city of Manila as the capital of the dominion of the Philippine Islands, that were called like that because of the King Philip II of Spain. So from the beginning, it was considered that the colonies, the settlers of Philippines, the vecinos of Manila, they needed to have some privileges to trade with New Spain so they could maintain themselves. So from a very early date, also after the foundation of Manila, the crown allowed the Spanish subjects living in Philippines to send a yearly ship to New Spain that was very soon called the Galleon de Manila. And they could fill this galleon with Asian goods that included textiles, spices, and many other things that could be sold and exchanged by silver from the mines of New Spain, and that silver be brought back to Philippines and help the colony to maintain against the enemies that surrounded the Philippines, because there was this Muslim sultanates, the Chinese Empire, the Japanese Empire. So it was a very hostile region, let's say. But at the same time, the Philippine Islands, especially Manila, became an entrepot for traders from all of Asia, even all of the Indic Ocean, way back to India. So the coast of Coromandel also sent merchants that participated in the trade that took place in Manila. And even the European enemies of Spain, like the Dutch and the English, traded in Manila in times of war and peace. So Manila became a sort of commercial large hub for all of the trade of East Asia. And a lot of the goods that resulted from the exchange came to New Spain via the galleon. So it was this yearly voyage. It was a very, very large ship, or sometimes a couple of ships, but mostly a very large ship filled to the top with Asian goods that came finally to Acapulco, where there was this great commercial fair where these Asian products were exchanged by the silver of New Spain. So this was a trade that was originally established for the benefit of the vecinos of Manila, but in the end, it was the the traders of New Spain that ended controlling the trade, because since they were the financiers of silver mining production, they had lots of silver to exchange for Asian goods. So in the end, it was them that controlled that market and controlled the distribution of Asian goods in New Spain. And they determined what things were most suitable for sale in the cities and towns of New Spain. A lot of cotton textiles, the manta de cielo, as we call it, was originally an Asian product that came in the Galeón de Manila for poor people to make their own clothes. And so the same happened with Asian products that were used as ingredients. Cinnamon became a mainstay of New Spanish kitchens, but also other things that we normally don't think about, like tuba, which is a beverage made from coconut and is very typical in Colima and other parts of Western Mexico. And this came from the 16th century. So it was a very early addition to Mexican culinary traditions. Were not reduced only to spices, but that was very important in the end. There was also an introduction, things like the consumption of corn, of maize in the Filipinas. This was a two-way trip in many senses. Not only goods came from Manila, also enslaved Asian people sold in New Spain and ended up contributing to this mixture of culinary cultures that happened in New Spain. So we are talking about a two-way trip that lasted right until the very end of the colonial period in 1815, when the last trip of the Manila Galleon took place.
Just the Manila Galleon deserves its own series of podcasts, obviously. And talking about what came and went, not only physical things, but also knowledge, was often treated in two ways. Whenever there were edible plants, for instance, that were extracted from New Spain and disseminated, you mentioned corn or chiles, and I don't know, we can say many things. So all of these were extracted, but the knowledge and obviously the cultural symbolisms attached to them did not travel with them. Therefore, we see time and time again how the cultural life of these commodities was very different from the life they had here in New Spain. We don't see nixtamalization, for example, where corn was disseminated because the knowledge to do it didn't travel with it. On the other hand, there is the case of the medicinal uses of certain plants that did travel, but for a very specific reason. And that was because it was weaponized for the benefit of empires. And there is one case of a document that gives us a detailed knowledge of the medicinal use of plants. And that is the one-of-a-kind document, the Códice de la Cruz Badiano, also known by its Latin name, Libellus de Medicinalibus Indorum Herbis, written finished, rather, in 1552 at the Imperial College of Indians in Santa Cruz de Tlatelolco by two authors, Martín de la Cruz, who wrote in Nahuatl, and he was himself indigenous, and he provided the descriptions of the uses and descriptions also of the plants. And lecturer Juan Badiano, who was also a clergyman, he translated the text into Latin. And this codice really constitutes a wonderful opportunity to study the ethnopharmacological and ethnobotanical knowledge in Mesoamerica that survived into the viceregal period. Well, the object itself, had a very serendipitous life. It changed many hands, was sent to Spain, but it suddenly disappeared and reappeared and eventually was returned to Mexico. But the point I'm trying to make is that although this is very important, and I want you to tell us more about that, the second part of this is that not only from New Spain, but also from other Spanish colonies in the Americas, where key knowledge of uses of plants, namely the use of the cinchona tree bark from the Amazonia that is used to extract quinine, that is known for its anti-malarial qualities, was also known later as Jesuit's bark, Smilax ornata or sarsaparilla from Mesoamerica, that was used and still is used to treat psoriasis, that were fundamental for the imperial expansion of Europe in Africa in posterior centuries. So can you tell us first a little bit more about the Códice de la Cruz Badiano and then this other weaponized use of botanical knowledge?
That's a very interesting and unique case in the history of this exchange of knowledge between New Spain and Europe, right? Because we know there was an important tradition of the use of medicinal herbs, indigenous medicine before the arrivals of the Europeans, but as in many cases, that knowledge was lost in large part because it was not acknowledged used directly for colonial administration, by taxation, or for the preaching of the Catholic religion, right? So much of that knowledge was linked to religious conceptions about body, about the relationship of human beings with nature that Spanish missionaries considered as demonic. So much of that was lost. And even later, people that used herbs to treat illnesses was sometimes suspected because it was mixed with ceremonies and rituals. We have references in the documents from the Mexican Inquisition that tell us about this combination of ritual and traditional knowledge of herbs that comes under suspicion by the Inquisition. But the case of the Códice de la Cruz Badiano is very interesting because it was produced in this privileged space that was the Colegio de Santa Cruz de Tlatelolco that you just mentioned. The Colegio de Tlatelolco, or this school, was conceived as a special place where the children of the indigenous elite that had participated or came to good terms with the Spanish during the conquest could be educated so they could become eventually Catholic priests or go back to their towns to rule these towns as Christian rulers and help the missionaries in the mission of converting all the masses of New Spain to Christianity. So it was a very privileged space. So the students that went there learned things that were not taught to the rest of the indigenous population, like Latin, Greek, music, rhetoric, and other knowledge that were known in Europe as the liberal arts. And that also included philosophy and natural philosophy, including the human body and the relationship between the macrocosmos and the microcosmos, that is human body. It was something to be expected, that pre-Hispanic knowledge about the human body and the ways to treat illnesses would come to be studied in the Colegio of Tlatelolco. And so that made possible the existence of the Códice de la Cruz Badiano. This manuscript was intended as a basic source of this knowledge that could help reconcile the European medical tradition and the indigenous medical tradition. Because what we see in the drawings and in the texts in Latin, we have these drawings, very detailed, made in indigenous pictographical tradition of plants and herbs. And there we see a very interesting and special combination of classical tradition from Greece and Rome, the four humors of the human body, with ideas of the properties of plants that came clearly from the indigenous tradition. So it is very difficult to separate those because it is clear that in Tlatelolco they found ways to reconcile those traditions to make it useful even in commercial terms. That probably was the reason for the Códice to exist, because it is said it was the son of Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza that took the Códice to Spain in order to help the Spanish crown to see that there was a lot of commercial potential in the trade of these plants of New Spain that could be exported to be sold for its medical use.
I have not thought about that. Sorry for interrupting, but I had not thought about that Códice as a commercial inventory, like a catalog.
Yes.
That just completely changes, right, how we understand this document and why it was so important to have it sent there, right?
Of course. And only a few years after the Códice was sent to Europe, we have Nicolás de Monardes in Sevilla, who is writing and publishing this treatise on all these plants from the Americas that can be used to treat illnesses, that can be used for its commercial value. It is clear that these plants had a certain meaning for indigenous cultures. But then they acquire a very different meaning for the Europeans. The Europeans see them in a very different way. They not necessarily pick up the indigenous knowledge, but they develop knowledge more suitable to the European markets. Europeans were able to discover other possibilities different from those that were more usual for indigenous societies. That's the case of chocolate, right? Its significance and use in Europe was transformed completely, and Europeans went to great pains to find the medical uses of chocolate, and there were entire treatises written to demonstrate that chocolate could be used to strengthen organisms weakened by disease, by famine, and that chocolate could be a remedy, even could be consumed without breaking the fast ordered by the church in certain parts of the year. So it was a new translation suited to the needs of Europeans. At the same happened with other herbs. You talked about the quinine that was used by the Jesuits as a medical commodity, and other plants that changed their meanings and uses in the hands of the Europeans. That was not something the indigenous people could know or respect. Also, other plants were used by the Europeans in the textile industry. It's a total change of meaning, and therefore another form of economic exploitation by the Europeans.
Ivan, I want to talk 5 more days with you. I think we need to bring things back to the present and talk about, what you do as a historian, but also crossing media as well, because I know you teach and you're very active in academic events, dissemination of knowledge, and all of those very noble endeavors, but also, and this is how we met, in social media. We can talk about you as a researcher and content creator. So we come from different disciplines, both from the humanities, and in different ways, we're trying to make accessible information and knowledge in a way that we think, is going to be interesting and useful, relevant for people. And if we're honest, neither of us does it for the likes. And we certainly don't do it for the money. It's just passion, right? So I am constantly weary and frustrated by the way formal academia largely disregards socializing knowledge beyond the classic self-serving exercises of like publishing academic journals that no one else but academics can even find, or these ridiculously expensive books that no one can afford. I think partly what drives me to do what I do and the way I do it is, of course, in my case, challenging the views that exoticize Mexican food and present a critique on the culinary mythologies that exist around Mexican food, and also reclaiming the narratives about it, about what is said about Mexican traditions and food culture in the Anglophone global scenario. But that is my case. I want to hear about your motivations and what challenges you have faced in your discipline, because I know you have your own frustrations, right? And I think there is this big taboo in academia and around the use of social media, podcasting or blogging, that it's slowly changing. Around the world, we see more and more academics entering these media platforms. But most of these platforms are actually overtaken by influencers. You and I have exchanged many times messages over content that is really, really not good and not helpful, and they don't engage critically. Like, they just do it for entertainment without any value, right? Why should we care about history ultimately, which is, I think, what you're trying to communicate, right, in your platform?
Yes. Well, thanks a lot for the chance to express my views on this difficult subject, because as you just said, I feel myself as a very strange sort of academic, because like all my colleagues, I do my research work, and I write and publish, teach, advise dissertations. I do anything an ordinary academic does, but I'm not satisfied with that, because I can see that all around us, people talk about history, not the sort of history they were taught in school, in elementary school, that comprise only names and dates and battles. Not that kind of history, but the history that tells people relevant things that will help them understand themselves and the world they live in. That means a socially relevant knowledge. And sometimes in academia, we forget completely, even worse, we don't care about that. We think that what we do is good for itself and does not need to justify its importance and its utility. I mean, that's for me, that's very frustrating. From a very early moment in my life as an academic, I realized that those things that you just said, that people were not reading us. They do not read our journals. They do not read our books. Yeah, maybe because they are expensive, but even worse, because you can't read them. They were so badly written. They're written for people, for ordinary people, not to understand what we are saying. And it's terrible because we know things about the past that would be so important for the people around us, but we are not communicating them. We do not communicate with people. In fact, that's part that, at least in my case, I wasn't taught at all during my training as a historian, as an academic historian, to communicate with people around us and to talk in an ordinary, everyday language about the things I know. It was not considered important. But in the years after that, I have learned that we have to do it, because if we historians do not do it, other people with little knowledge about these same things will take our place. People that see themselves as influencers, right? Without really having the knowledge, and they only talk from ignorance, or even worse, prejudice. They are people biased who are trying to promote sometimes very dangerous views about history that promote racism, all the bad things, that are causing trouble in our societies, that promote ideas about the autocracy. They're planting this alternative narrative of history built from prejudice and oriented to promote views that we thought that progress had helped us overcome in the course of history, and then they are back like fascism, right? And the sad thing is that they use history, or what they call history, as a tool, as a weapon. They weaponize it, as you have said. And the historians are silent. They're not giving their own narrative that can be a remedy against these prejudiced, biased visions that use a so-called history as a way to promote their means between society. And it is sad that my colleagues do not see it. In the last years, we have seen, for instance, in Spain, raising this new alternative discourse. For instance, they deny that there was a Spanish colonialism. They say it was a benevolent tutorship that helped barbarous and savage peoples to enter civilization, of course, Christian Western civilization. And they sell it everywhere and promoting the vote for the far right everywhere. And that's coming even to Mexico and Latin America. And the historians are not saying anything. I'm sick of that. I have to say it as clear as I am saying this right now. I'm sick of that because they use lies, half-truths. They're trying to promote this discourse, and we have to say something. And I think that's my duty as a historian. So what to do? Well, people are all watching their cell phones all the time. Well, let's talk as those people do, because they do it. They use social media to promote their speech, their hate speech, and all these things. Well, let's use the same recipe to promote a different conversation about history. And that's what I'm doing. And thanks to that, we have met and we're discussing these things for our audience, right?
So it works. That I hope that proves it works.
Well, yeah, I hope so too.
It always feels obviously like an uphill battle. It's one against the world, but at the same time, I absolutely agree with everything that you just said. I mean, we're just people who are passionate about topics and have invested years of our lives studying something because we think it matters. Not just because it is interesting, which it is interesting to us, but because we think it matters, right? Stepping outside the ivory tower where academia likes to dwell, it is a very frightening, a very lonely, challenging experience because you become a voice between a lot of noise, and sometimes people feel entitled, obviously, because you put content on social media to give their uninformed opinions, to judge and all that. But despite the trolling and despite this toxic culture of entertainment for the sake of entertainment without critical engagement, I think it's something that we have to continue doing. And the way to amplify that, I think, is by literally just trying to reach out to other people like you and I just did, no? Adding up our separate efforts and start building this little network of people who, from different entry points, are trying to contribute to have better discussions, to have more informed understanding of reality, the past and the present, and bridging all these things that help us have a better relationship with our past, have a better understanding of our intercultural relationships as well, outside of our country and inside of our country, and also to sort of break the silos between disciplines, right? Because ultimately we are on the same boat.
Yes, that's right. That's right. I agree completely with you. We need to learn a lot. Just the fact that we're having this conversation on a podcast. To produce a podcast is a skill that you have to learn. So you could have conversations with people like me and the other people that you have interviewed in your podcast, right? Or myself, I have to learn how to use Instagram, the resources of social media, to communicate messages that I consider relevant. We need to be humble to recognize that we have a lot to learn if we want to share this knowledge that we have learned before we enter this path of communicating by this media, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that is one thing that is probably that critique is more aimed to academia than to our audiences, because I think our audiences get it. And also we need to do a lot of intellectual exercise in order to reframe things in a way that are accessible, interesting to people, but also mainstream academic culture that looks down on the use of social media platforms because it's an easy way out. It is not. It's everything but easy.
Oh, yes, I so much agree with you.
Easy is to do what everybody does. Difficult is to jump blindingly and with a lot of faith because you really believe that you can make a difference. And I thank you for the difference that you're making on your platform, for being so generous with your time. And it was a challenge behind this episode. There were many conversations and exchanges sort of testing the limits of both of our knowledge and expertise, and try to find a middle ground in which we could both bring something new, because each conversation I try to present on the podcast, it's something that takes me out of my comfort zone and takes me out of my boundary of knowledge of things. So to complete another piece of the puzzle is why I have experts like you who are also willing to step out.
That's right.
and add up to this territory of food studies in general. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
I hope we can sit again. I would like to have you make a public commitment about talking more about the Trans-Pacific trade and the Manila galleons. How about that?
I'm totally into it.
Yes. I hope it doesn't take me other 300 years to get to that. I wish all of your projects continue growing and you find and reach more eager people to learn from you. Please give people your Instagram account so they can find you and follow you.
Oh, yes, of course. It's at el_cronista _novohispano, el cronista novohispano.
Which is the Novo Hispanic Chronicler, which I think is an adorable name. I really hope everyone enjoys this conversation as much as we have. Certainly I have.
Thank you, Rocio. I also hope that you continue with this fantastic project of yours.
Thank you for listening. This episode was researched by Dr. Iván Escamilla and myself, and it was produced by me, Rocio Carvajal. For those interested in knowing more about Dr. Iván, his research and social media, I have put together a list of links and resources for you in the description of the episode. Also, in the accompanying blog post on my website and newsletter, you can find this information. If you have any questions, comments, or just want to say hi, well, you can reach out to me on social media. Find me on Instagram or Twitter. Alternatively, you can also drop me a line to hello@pasachipotle.com. If you enjoyed the show, please recommend it to a friend. You can also show your appreciation by rating the pod with 5 stars and a review on your podcast app. To get my ebooks, you can pop anytime into my digital book stand. And if you're planning on visiting Mexico next year, well, maybe it is time to treat yourself to a fabulous foodie experience with me, eating your way through Puebla's delicious history. You can find all the links on the show's description. That's it for me today, and also that's it for me for the year. See you on the other side in 2025.